let's get on to Animal Farm. Everybody
Yeah.
wanted us to read this book. It's a classic. It's short, and it's an allegory. Are there any? How many other famous? How many other books this famous are allegories, Walter?
Not quite like this. I mean, he literally called it a fairy tale
Yeah.
as a subtitle in England. Um, I mean, you put me on the spot there, but it, it is unique in the sense that it is probably considered one of the great novels of the 20th century, and there aren't many that use this mode because it's a really difficult mode. And I'll tell you, the funny thing is, though we say it's short and everything, my wife and I both agreed that when we picked up Animal Farms as adults, we were like, did we read like simplified versions as kids? Because this is actually more complex and dense than we remembered. I remembered it as almost a, Stuart Little or a children's book.
Right. Yeah. Something that could be that you would need multiple illustrations just to fill out the book enough to make a book, right?
Right.
But no, yeah, it's Animal Farm: A Fairy Story is the title, and it begins in this really interesting way. It says Mr. Jones of the Manor Farm had locked the hen houses for the night, but was too drunk to remember to shut the pop holes. With the ring of light from his lantern dancing from side to side, he lurched across the yard, kicked off his boots at the back door, drew himself a last glass of beer from the barrel of the scullery, and made his way up to bed, where Mrs. Jones was already snoring. And then the action begins, where there is a big white boar named Major who has had a dream, and we're going to hear all about this dream. So this essentially the book takes place on a farm. The villain, it begins with the villain, who are the farmers, the Joneses, and immediately we move into the barn, and we hear about this story. Walter, do you want to is there anything you want to say about the setup before we get into maybe some of the quotes from this? Because
Yeah.
mhm.
Well, historically, I think the thing to recognize about this book is that George Orwell was a democratic socialist. In other words, he had enough hope for socialism that he was willing to criticize Soviet communism. Most of the great critiques of communist and Stalinist, in particular, overreach were by people who had hopes for the movement or still had them. The enemy, the reactionary, will just demonize you. It's your own side that will see right through your, your posturing. So this farm is obviously, like all farms, the entirety of the world or the entirety of England or the entirety of a society. The farmer is the oppressor, very simply. He's human. And the first revolutionary moment in the book is Major's dream, in which he says, hey, if humans weren't telling us what to do, weren't just feeding us enough to do our work, and then, making us expend every last calorie, if they were giving us back some of the surplus that they create, we'd be free. It's Mom Donnie's dream. It really is. Like, it's what Bernie just said.
If not for the oligarchs,
how in this rich society have we so little, and the funny thing about Orwell is that these are all farm animals. None of them went to Hotchkiss. In other words, none of them are actually, infiltrators from the upper classes and not really animals. That's the mind-bending part of this current predicament. In this one, they're all actual farm animals with a legitimate grievance, which is that they're sent off to slaughter. They're fed just enough so that they can
work to death.
They're worked to death. You sympathize with them, and the farmers are drunk.
Absolutely, and Look, there's probably a reference here to the real world progression of the Russian Revolution, right? Lenin's will, his testament, the dying revolutionary leader, reportedly told,
Right.
right? So there's a hint of that in this, which is that Major's dream is going to become the sacred text of the movement, much in the way that the sort of post-Lenin history of the Soviet Union was a lot about reading the doctrine of Lenin's words, or
Right.
making this or that mean support for future programming. But what you said about the essential point, I think, was summed up in this part of Major's speech, which is where he says, "Is it not crystal clear then, comrades, that all the evils of this life of ours spring from the tyranny of human beings?" Right? So he gives this very eloquent, very very enraging, passionate speech about the mistreatment of farm animals at the hands of the Jones the farmer, and builds up to this point where he says, he's even set us animals against one another. We have to realize our common interests, and once we do, we will be free. Once we realize that there is an oppressor that we can be rid of, then we can finally be free and graduate into a higher form of existence. And it's kind of convincing at the beginning of the story, isn't it?
Well, you see, we're looking at it now with knowledge of what it's about, and adult educations and so on. But as a kid, when I read it, and not knowing what was coming, I remember thinking, this is going to be a book about success. It didn't seem like a doomed experiment. Even now, it's hard to get in the mindset of the excited animals when you know how Animal Farm really ends, or what it really connotes and what it means. And this time, reading it with that sort of retrospective wisdom, or knowledge at least, I feared for the animals almost instantly, because I know what a crushing job Orwell's going to do of dashing their hopes and exposing them. And I almost didn't want to see the whip come down. You know what I mean? I almost wish the book was longer and dwelt longer in the idyllic early part.
Yeah, no, unfortunately there's no respite in this book. It starts off in conflict, misery, and it's only going to get worse, right?
Yeah.
And the setup that you see coming early on is this sort of primitive, false, Major's old and he's about to die, right? And maybe he's sincere in his belief that animals are a higher form of life, and wouldn't succumb to the same kind of temptations to oppress that human beings would. And maybe he's genuinely believes that things will be better.
Almost when he died, at what point do you feel the thing turning? You know what I mean? What's the first foreshadowing of disaster for you?
So in the first chapter, at the end of his speech, the speech is sort of deeply radical.
It's I have a dream. In a way, I mean, it's more us and them than that. But
yeah, that's what I mean. So there's this part. Never listen when they tell you that man and the animals have a common interest, that the prosperity of the one is the prosperity of the others. It is all lies. Man serves the interest of no creature except himself. And among us animals, let there be perfect unity, perfect comradeship in the struggle. All men are enemies. All animals are comrades. And I'm sorry, that's AOC's speech right there, right?
Okay, so you're absolutely right. And you know what? And you know what rings false or ominous in that speech? perfect, all. In other words, one of the reasons why I didn't necessarily detect anti-communism when I was a kid in this was that what I saw it was dreaming. In other words, utopianism. You know, you can't have dystopian fiction without utopian pretensions. And as soon as you hear that speech of that, you know, that dying animal, you're like, none of this can come true. Perfection can't be real. Absolute enmity can't be real. Any statement that begins with all can't be real. And you just know this is a balloon blown up to pop. Much earlier than I thought the turn came. The turn comes at the beginning.
Yeah, and is that out of ignorance or inexperience because they've never been in charge of anything before, or is it?
Well, that's definitely one of the themes of the book is inexperience, and
Right.
that's what I was emphasizing with Mamdani. I think he's going to be out of his depth, but early on in the book, as they try to bring in the harvest, you know, and so on, you go like, you guys just don't know how to do stuff. You know, it's just piling on one portent after another. You overpromised. You don't know how things work. You've got a absolute ideology which isn't built for life.
Yeah, and also early in the speech, they also lay out Major, who they described as the prize middle white boar. I had also remembered this character as a horse, believe it or not, but it is a boar.
Right.
But in the speech, Major lays out the case that animals are actually better than people, and that people are morally inferior, and almost a parasitic form of life form. Man is the only creature that consumes without producing. He does not give milk. He does not lay eggs. He is too weak to pull the plow. He cannot run fast enough to catch rabbits. Yet he is lord of all the animals. He sets them to work. He gives back to them the bare minimum that will prevent them from starving, and the rest he keeps for himself. And this is right away. They're setting up this idea that evil is something that's exclusive to people, and among animals, once the people are out of the picture, things will be beautiful. As you say, it will be perfect, right? And nothing is perfect, as we know in life.
You're absolutely right. And what's interesting about that speech, and it reminded me of again of AOC, is that when people get their basic facts wrong, there's something to be feared. And when he talks about what people don't, something with the plow, he skips over the fact that people invented the plow.
Right.
You
exactly.
know, there's so much there that is taken for granted in the list of what people's deficiencies are. There is behind them a human triumph that goes unmentioned, you know, the invention of farming.
Yeah.
And so on. And that's what's scary about that rhetoric in real life too. When you're not really telling us how New York was settled, when you're actually either don't know or you're lying about it, then the bomb is already ticking, because whatever that reality is that you're suppressing or sidelining is the one that's going to come for you. And the animals, by completely demeaning human intelligence, capabilities, work, and so on, have already sealed their doom.
Right, because what they don't realize is, and this is the generous interpretation of what's about to happen in the book, is that because of their inexperience, because of the novelty of self-governance, that they're not aware that they're going to have to make difficult decisions once with power,
and they're later going to become dependent on humans.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And they're going to become the very thing that they themselves despise the most. And I don't know. I mean, I saw this so much over in Russia. Like, for instance, trade unions. Where you would you'd see a factory maybe, right, that was once run by rich czarist industrialists, in the Soviet period was taken over by the trade unions, but the unions stopped being unions pretty quickly. They just move into the management and eliminate trade unions. You know what I'm saying? Like the Soviets were inexperienced with running a country, and so they eliminated they just saw things like trade unions as enemies to their rule and irritants, and just wiped them out and made them illegal, making it even worse than what went on during the Tsarist period. And that's what's going to happen, obviously, in this book, is that they're under the knout of the farmer Jones, and some of the animals, we're going to get to the line, some animals are more equal than others, but the ones that are more equal are going to prey upon the rest. Right. And just the inability to see that coming is kind of amazing in retrospect, right? I mean, I guess it could only happen if you've never had the experience of any life experience before. I don't know.
There are people from South America, there are people from Eastern Europe who look at Mamdani or anywhere else in the world, and they already know the ending. Okay, they know the ending. That's what's freaking them out right now. It's like, I have seen 100 stories start this way, and I know how they end. Just as when we go into Animal House again as adults, we know how it ends. We can feel the seeds of its destruction in almost the second paragraph. And it's really hard for people who are older, from other places or whatever it is, to watch a phenomena play out that they already know the ending of, and to hear their warnings go unheeded, and hear their wisdom trampled on and called, reactionary fear or whatever. And so in some ways, I look at Mamdani as I do at the very beginning of Animal Farm. I'm like already trying to figure out which aspects of his presentation and his rhetoric are going to contribute to the
downfall,
to the tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like I don't have any doubt about that, about the tragedy. I know that's going to happen. I just don't know exactly how it's going to play out, just as I can't quite remember in the beginning of Animal Farm how it plays out.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. Like, what's going to be the end game for Mamdani? I mean, look, I think it's entirely possible that he'll become electorally successful, and that this movement will spread significantly for a bit. I just think that there is an inevitable bad ending that's coming. We just don't know where it's going to happen yet.
The great thing about this book is that it seems to almost describe laws of nature. You know what I mean? The reason that it's so bracing is that you can't, the way it's set up, you can't imagine any other course of events or any other ending or so on. It seems to be kind of a case closed book, and opening it up again, I want to not read it as a case closed book. I want to, rediscover, the weight the places at which it could have taken other turns, and be surprised by it again. But looking at Mamdani, I see a case closed book starting. And it might be my temperament, my age, might be my education, a million things, but it's hard to watch. It's like watching real life Animal Farm.
Yeah, exactly. Just to take an example, at the beginning of the second chapter of the book, Orwell introduces basically the deadly idea, the thing that will kill the movement. 3 nights later, old Major died peacefully in his sleep. His body was buried at the foot of the orchard. This was early in March. During the next 3 months, there was much secret activity. Major's speech had given to the more intelligent animals on the farm a completely new outlook on life. They did not know when the rebellion predicted by Major would take place. They had no reason for thinking that it would be within their own lifetime, but they saw clearly that it was their duty to prepare for it. And so this is the birth of vanguardism, right? It's the idea that a movement for all must be led by the more capable, right?
And Matt, you know what also it has in common with what's going on in New York? When their little revolution comes, it's shockingly easy. It happens it almost happens like a house of cards falling. They're suddenly in possession of the keys. It's not a big struggle. Right.
And that's true. And that's happened over and over again in history, right? I mean, even Lenin and all those guys were relatively surprised by how easy it was to seize power. Of course, it required some extraordinary circumstances in the middle of a world war and some other things, but this idea that, well, we can't just leave it to the organic process of the working class rising up at some point. We, the more enlightened, intelligent folk who see the truth, have to lead this thing and strategize and exercise power on behalf of the true and inevitable movement. And that has happened in every single one of the socialist uprisings in history, right? Like, well, maybe not every single one, but in a lot of them, there has been this vanguard class that's risen up.
Yes,
and part of the ethos of being secretly smarter and in charge is that you assume the right to lie on behalf of the movement. You're already withholding certain things from the other animals in the farm, right? And we already see this with this movement. You see Mamdani giving this speech about how, well, we don't have the support for all the things that we would want, like, seizing the means of production. So we'll wait. We'll talk about the things that people are ready for, and then, when the time comes, we'll talk about those other things so that we can bring people to those things, right? So they're already laying out this idea of, we'll strategize, we'll decide when to play which cards, as opposed to just letting the movement organically happen.
So this is an interesting phenomenon, but Bruce Springsteen, they made a biopic of Bruce Springsteen, and it's bombing. And I saw an essay the other day which said the reason is that Bruce Springsteen was actually an authentic working class hero. And then he started going off on yachts and, becoming a sort of a World Economic Foundation marquee partier along with David Geffen and Barack and so on. And just nobody buys it anymore. Well, this is the opposite trajectory where, the privileged people are going to try to turn themselves into working class heroes. In this book, the pigs are given intelligence above the other. Orwell almost believes in a form of racism or speciesism. we're to believe the pigs are just smarter than the other animals. The other animals try to learn to read. They never succeed. They can't even, memorize the alphabet. So not only are the pigs a vanguard, but they are actually superior. They have superior skills. And part of the story that Orwell is telling is that each of these animals has a nature. There's a horse that I forgot, a mare that's very pretty and likes to have ribbons in her hair. And her first question about the revolution is, will there still be sugar afterwards?
Yeah.
Will I still be able to wear ribbons? And more than I remembered, what he's saying is that every animal's nature it can't be melded into this one class. They never overcome their imprinted species-based differences, frankly. I think one thing he's saying is that there is no revolutionary class as such. The idea that everybody can be blended into that is one thing that he's criticizing. And I think when he called the book a fairy story, Orwell was sophisticated enough. What he meant by that is the fairy story is the fairy story of Stalinism.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the whole idea that all animals are comrades, I mean, you're right. It falls apart in this passage. The stupidest questions of all were asked by Molly, the white mare. The very first question she asked Snowball, who's a pig, was, "Will there still be sugar after the rebellion?" "No," said Snowball firmly. "We will have no means of making sugar on this farm. Besides, you do not need sugar. You'll have all the oats and hay you want." "And shall I be allowed to wear ribbons in my mane?" asked Molly. "Comrade," said Snowball, "those ribbons are that you were so devoted to are the badge of slavery. Can you not understand that liberty is worth more than ribbons?" Molly agreed, but she did not sound very convinced. And so already, there's concessions, right? Authority, and there's the pigs are essentially exercising authority. Within that, once they do that, the game's basically up, right? There's not going to be any natural all animals are comrades once these divisions are revealed, and once the fact that some animals are going to exercise power over others is revealed to take place.
The pigs are going to end up at the French Laundry. We know that. And one of the reasons that this book is so powerful is that it has been affirmed. It was written in 1945, or it was published in 1945. And it's been affirmed again and again on an almost semi-annual basis in country after country and society after society. That's why I didn't think it was about communism as a kid. What I thought it was about was deception, hypocrisy, selfishness, and the fantasy of believing that everybody can be made equal when they're not the same.
Right.
So how I didn't know much about communism. All I knew that the Soviet Union was a place that had a dictator and some rockets with nuclear bombs aimed at us.
Right. A Travolta with rockets.
Yeah. I thought this was about human nature.
Right.
This book.
Yeah, and it is. Absolutely. It just so happens that it's an allegory that perfectly matches what happened after Lenin died. Right. When all of the pigs who in the party who were interpreting the true faith for the actual proletariat in Russia, and constantly changing their mind and forcing people to you make concessions that they might not have agreed to in the beginning. The Russian peasants didn't like to have to give up the idea that they could sell a few things here and there, and have a nicer horse or mule than their neighbors or whatever it is. Like that wasn't a thing that came naturally to the people in the countryside, but the pigs who were in charge, sure made quick work of the sort of old notions of how life was. And and their religious devotion. That was something a little minor thing they had to give up in order to live in this new paradise.
Do you think if you gave this book to a 20-year-old who hadn't read it, who was enthralled with AOC and Mamdani and so on, that they would recognize that this was a commentary on what they're seeing?
No.
Or you don't think they would? They'd even...
I continually run into this. I feel like we're in this new space where knowledge of what actually happened, not just in Russia, but in China, in Cambodia, all these other places in the world, but particularly with the original Soviet Revolution, which is so thoroughly documented and has been so completely dissected, and almost nobody knows anything about it in this country, and especially the gruesome, horrible, extremely violent, and disgusting parts. I mean, the notion of somebody wearing a death's head tattoo is immediately controversial because it conjures images of death camps. But there were death camps of basically almost equal stature in the other revolution, and it's like most people haven't even heard of it. Somehow they think the gulags were a lesser phenomenon.
Well, you know what's now on reflection, what's so freaky about AOC's account of how New York City was settled is how much of it was settled by people fleeing communism and socialism.
Well, absolutely.
And she left it completely out. And I can't imagine what it's like to be a New Yorker who came from that background watching this happen again. It's like,
she should go visit Brighton Beach and ask all the people who came over in the late 70s, and that was just the last wave of people. But the people in 20s, 30s, a lot of Jews came over right from the Pale. There were so many refugees from communist countries throughout the period after the 1917. She left all of that out, and that you're right, that's kind of an amazing omission when you think about it.
People fleeing the Holocaust, no, Holocaust you didn't get to flee, except for a few. Some people fled the rise of fascism, yes, seeing in prospect that there might be a Holocaust, but the Holocaust was not something that you left. But Russia, you did. Eastern Europe, you did. And the willingness to not tell the truth, or the ignorance of the truth, suggests to me that you're right. They wouldn't learn anything from Animal Farm. They don't have the chops to know what's being said. But I don't know that I did as a kid. Like I said, I thought it was about hypocrisy, selfishness, and how naturally people would take more until it was all gone,
Right. But that's one of the reasons why I think this book works. Even though he's clearly he's clearly using the actual historical facts of the Soviet Revolution as a guide to the plot. It works on its own as an allegory, because all the things that happen in it ring true. It rings true that that these animals on a farm are mistreated, and if they were to suddenly have consciousness and be inspired by a dream that revealed to them the awfulness of their position, they might very well get together and decide, at some future time, we're going to be rid of people and things will be better. That's true, but it's also true that if there were pigs that were smarter, that they would do this. They would ruin the thing from the very beginning, right? And that's why the story works for me.
As Orwell understood it, the problem was that they weren't real communists. The problem was that they betrayed the principles. I don't think that he came out of this not believing in Marxism or in the British versions of socialist equity and so on. I think he believed that this was a tragedy. But there's an interesting feature of the book that I read about, which is that somebody who had fled Stalin came to him and said, as he was about to publish the book, Stalin saved Russia from Germany by being such a bastard, such a horrible, intransigent, grandiose, selfish dictator. He stood his ground. He did not flee, and he saved the Soviet Union from the German Nazi, invasion. And Orwell had to take that into account, he said, that there was actually a virtue to this kind of a tyrant in certain historical situations. That's a complexity that I never understood before,
Yeah, I mean it's complicated because there was originally a truce, and the thing that Stalin wanted more than ever was to be Hitler's friend, so that Hitler would never invade. And then when Hitler broke the deal, Stalin, was initially paralyzed, but then he did eventually, mobilize the country. It was significantly at a disadvantage because he had massacred most of the general staff of the armed forces because he was afraid of them in the purges of 37 and 38. But it is true that the Soviet Union, I mean, suffering much more than we did during World War II. With casualties far beyond what we could even conceive of, that they did beat back the Nazis, and without that, where would the world be? You do have to take that into consideration. But I do think it's interesting that his bigger doubts, Orwell's bigger doubts about socialism in general, was shown through more in the later book in 1984, right? Yeah. Because this book is, as you say, this is an allegory about the misuse of power that ruins a beautiful dream, right?
And I read something really interesting. T.S. Eliot, the famous poet, was at that time the head of a British publishing house, Faber and Faber. And Orwell sent this book to Eliot. And Eliot was a high Anglican Christian, traditionalist, classicist, and so on. Okay. A snob. And Eliot read the book and rejected it. And he said, I don't think your scheme, I don't think your satirical or allegorical point here is one that you make successfully. He said, if the pigs had just been more public spirited, if they had been better pigs, none of this would have happened. In other words, you think you've solved this, almost logical problem about the destiny of this kind of a totalitarian socialist society. But really, if the pigs had just been a little better, none of it would have happened. It's a kind of interesting and I think trenchant criticism of the book.
Yes, but okay, go ahead.
But maybe only those kind of pigs take over.
So no, but I disagree though. So because I think inherently what happens is, this system requires only one power, right? There can't be competing power centers in this kind of government. Power has to be concentrated, and it has to be total. The means of production can't be left partially unseized. They have to be completely seized. And so for me, the inherent problem that you always end up with this sort of proposition is that there's going to be a total concentration of power, and that never ends up anywhere except awful. I don't think when human
Well,
beings are involved.
I brought up Eliot's criticism. He failed. He's a footnote in history. Orwell proved his point over and over 1,000,000 times beyond T.S. Eliot's point. Well, if they'd had nicer, pigs, it would have been a different outcome. So you're right. I mean, it's just interesting to see how people who had not yet been steeped in the legend of Animal Farm saw it the first time it came across their desk.
But I think that is still how people look at this, though. They think, and as one of our listeners pointed out, what people usually say is that, well, that wasn't really socialism, that wasn't really communism before.
Right.
In all these other instances, it was a corruption of the true thing. And so if we just do it right, it'll work perfectly. Whereas, I think experience will tell you. The reason I'm such a fan of the American system is that it deeply analyzed human nature at the very beginning of the project and said, if we do this, it's going to end up badly. We're going to end up with a tyrant even worse than the one that we're throwing over.
It didn't rely on changing human nature,
right,
or melting everybody into a new kind of being, socialist man or whatever, as a precondition for success. And Matt, you're really right here. This book is an inevitable tragedy and an inevitable unwinding of an initial error. But I think it is in following that original fairy tale. Like, when everything goes wrong before you even know it, when you follow a fairy tale. After that, all you're going to do is take reality's revenge on the chops over and over and over. And it's the fairy tale nature of these campaigns that we're seeing. I mean, Donald Trump, yeah, he has his fairy tale. America was great, and we're going to get back to it, and da-da-da-da.
How much? Go ahead. I'm sorry. It's just
but it's
he's not earnest about. But
yeah, ahead. Exactly. He's not earnest about it. That's the funny thing about Donald Trump. He's like a Mark Twain character. He's like a riverboat character. We know the salesman. We know the salesman is somebody who's trying to get us to sell ourselves. And, we know the difference between whether the Bassomatic can really do all the dicing and slicing it claims, but it can do some. And it's good to be hyped about it. Whatever. These other people, this is real, like AOC especially there. This is revolutionary fervor. This is crazy stuff. This is lying about history. This is not even knowing about history or thinking it's important to know. And Madani is just cynical. I mean, the sine qua non is fakery, is fake crying. You know what I mean?
I know. No, it's awful. And look, I had an experience. I'll probably write about it someday where, I was in a mine in Russia at a time when there were just horrible industrial accidents because the new crooks who were running the mine who were just as bad as the communists who came before. Actually, the problem was they weren't quite just as bad. The people who ran it before, they weren't just thieves like the people in the Yeltsin era. People in the Yeltsin era just wanted to steal the coal, right? In the Soviet era, they had belief, and as a result, there were railways that were built that are literally built atop ground human bone from the slave laborers who were forced to construct 1,000 kilometers of railway to this coal site. And so the people there, what they feared more than anything was earnestness, belief, fervor, right? And as bad as the crooks were who were running the thing, that by the time I got there, it was like the lesser of two evils for them, because they had seen the other version, right? Like
the fairy tale believers are the more dangerous.
Right. It's and that's my inarticulate way of getting back to my original point, which is it's the Graham Plattner, Mamdani, AOC intellectual, like pseudo intellectual, who really, really, really believes, who scares me more than any other kind of character on earth, right? Because belief will get you in a lot more problems than cynicism and thievery, I think. You know what I mean? But I don't know. At least that I think that's the message of this book, is that these things inevitably get corrupted, right?
And also, they have their 7 commandments at the beginning of the book, and then they get caught breaking them, so they have to change the commandments, and then finally they just get rid of the commandments and have only one. What the dangerous part is, after the promises have been made and they start not performing, they start not meeting the quotas, they start getting caught being selfish or non-democratic socialist, then the excuses start, then the scapegoating starts, then the lying and making you lie to yourself starts, and then the terror comes.
Right. Yeah. So here in the beginning, it's just a gentle warning about the ribbons. It's going to get worse.
Right.
So we're just being introduced at the beginning of this book to the dream. It's not yet completely fucked up, or it hasn't gone wrong yet, but they've already planted the seeds for how it's going to go wrong. And I think it's great that we're doing this book at this moment, because it's a revival of this plot in America, in a place where we haven't seen it in a while. So it should be really interesting.
It's a little bit like a play-by-play. I mean, we're giving you a preview. I personally don't want the preview to be accurate in some ways, but in another way, I do want it to be accurate, because I want to cure us for the 100,000th time of this delusion. But there's the other part of me that goes, why not have free fast buses? Why not have da-da-da-da? That's still in me. And that's the part of me and others that gets a guy like this elected. Unfortunately, the 3/4 rest of me can watch this train crash into a wall from a distance, and know.
But they've already adopted exactly the platform of this book. It's in the book, it's human beings are the oppressors, and once we get rid of the oppressors, then we'll be fine. The new theology in universities is oppressors and oppressed. So once we get rid of the patriarchy and the old system and all of the good characters that AOC rattled off, once they have perfect comradeship, once we just get rid of those bad oppressors, things will be fine. It really is the same thing, and I just don't think they know how inherently flawed that thinking is. But we'll see. We'll go.
One last thing, and I mean, it's such a provocative book, and it really gets you thinking. One thing that I think Orwell is saying also is that nature exists. In other words, I think one of the reasons that we've got Mamdani and right now is that this technological age of ours has kind of convinced us that reality is what we make it. That it all can be shaped. We can AI program our own movies. That we've triumphed over certain old barriers and limitations that we don't even really recognize as existing. But in Animal Farm, you realize very early when they're bringing in the hay crops, and then when they have some apples come down in a wind, that, whoa, there's one thing that they didn't figure on, which is nature. And they're up against nature, and they're still in a battle with it. And they think that they're in a battle with humans, but they're in a battle with their own selves, and they're in a battle with the weather, literally, and land and the capacities of the land. And as you say, in the Soviet Union, it was the revenge in some ways of nature, the revenge of the weather, the revenge of the ground that undoes utopianism.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a perfect allegory for what we're going through now. They don't see that they're in a battle with nature. They don't see that nature even plays a role in any of this stuff. But we'll see how it goes. Anyway, I think if you haven't picked up the book yet, please do. It's an amazing reflection on this exact moment. So it should be a fun couple of weeks. So anyway, we'll thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you later this week. Thanks a lot, Walter.
Talk to you then.
Talk to you soon.